"Get off my console." Kale slapped at the flickering, iridescent appendage coiling around his primary flight stick. It retracted instantly, a blur of sapphire scales shifting to emerald green, but not before leaving a tingling static charge on his knuckles. He whipped around in the pilot's seat, heart hammering against his ribs. She was perched impossibly still on the back of the co-pilot chair, her large, obsidian eyes fixed on him, unblinking. A low trill vibrated in the cramped cockpit, the air suddenly thick with the scent of ozone and something else rain on hot metal. Her long, slender tail, the same one he'd just slapped, twitched slightly, the feathery filaments at its tip brushing the grimy ceiling panel. Scales, like liquid chrome spilled over a dancer's form, covered her from head to toe, shimmering with an internal light that pulsed faintly. Where the hell had she come from? He scanned the derelict freighter wreck 3 times before salvaging the pulse regulator. No life signs. Definitely no 6-foot-tall, glowing lizardwoman life signs. "Who are you? How did you get on my ship?" His voice was rougher than he intended, the adrenaline still buzzing. She tilted her head, the movement fluid, alien. The glow of her scales deepened to a rich violet, bathing the cockpit in an eerie light. Another trill, this one lower, resonant. It vibrated not just in the air, but in the metal deck beneath his boots, in the fillings in his teeth. He felt an odd pull, a dizzying sense of curiosity. No, that wasn't right. It felt like his own nerves were tuning forks reacting to her hum. She uncoiled from the chair, landing silently on the deck plating despite her height. She was closer now, close enough for him to see the intricate patterns shifting beneath the surface of her scales, like constellations drifting in a nebula. Close enough to smell that strange, electrocrane scent intensify. Her gaze dropped to his hand, the one that had touched her tail. Then slowly, deliberately, she reached out a 3-fingered hand, talons gently retracted. Kale flinched back instinctively, pressing himself against the worn leather of his seat. "Don't touch me." She paused, hand hovering in the space between them. The violet glow faded slightly, replaced by flickering patterns of silver and gold. She made a soft clicking sound, sharp and interrogative. Then she pointed a finger at his chest, then back at herself, and repeated the click. Kale stared. Was she trying to introduce herself? "Right, okay, pointing." He mimicked the gesture, pointing at his own chest. "Kale." He tapped his sternum. "Me, Kale." Her head tilted again, the long neck arching gracefully. The trill returned, softer this time, testing the shape of the sound. "Kkael," she echoed, the sound guttural yet strangely melodic. The glow on her throat pulsed with the effort. She tapped her own chest, her scales flashing bright cyan. "Lyra." The name resonated, the R rolling in a way his tongue couldn't replicate. It settled in the air like her scent, charged and unfamiliar. Lyra. He'd found a pulse regulator and gained Lyra. Great, just great. His ship, the rust bucket, was barely big enough for him, let alone a shimmering alien stowaway who seemed to communicate through mood lighting and weird humming. He needed to figure out what she was, where she came from, and how to get her off his ship before she attracted the wrong kind of attention, or before she decided his flight stick was a toy again. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the grit and exhaustion of the salvage run. "Okay, Lyra. Rule number 1, keep your appendages off my controls." He gestured emphatically at the console, then crossed his arms. Lyra watched his movements intently, her dark eyes reflecting the flashing lights of the dashboard. The silver and gold patterns on her scales swirled faster. Then, mimicking his gesture, she crossed her own arms, the movement sharp, almost mocking. A low, rumbling purr started deep in her chest, and Kale had the distinct, unsettling feeling he was being laughed at. This was going to be a long trip. The rust bucket jumped back into subspace, the familiar lurch settling Kale's stomach even as the situation with his unwanted passenger churned it. Lyra had retreated to the small cargo hold after their initial introduction, apparently content to explore the meager collection of salvaged tech and spare parts he kept strapped down back there. He'd tried locking the door, but the soft work click of the mechanism disengaging a few minutes later told him that wasn't going to work. Now she was back in the cockpit doorway, leaning against the frame, watching him pilot through the swirling blues and purples of the jump corridor. Her scales were a placid, oceanic teal, the glow soft and steady. Kale tried to ignore her, focusing on the nav computer readouts, but her presence was a tangible thing, a low-level hum just beneath his hearing, a subtle pressure against his senses. It was like trying to ignore a proximity alarm that never shut off. He risked a glance. She was examining a spanner wrench she'd picked up from his toolkit, turning it over and over in her three-fingered hands, her tail occasionally flicking against the bulkhead with a soft thump. "Find anything interesting back there?" he asked, aiming for casual, landing somewhere near strained. She looked up, her dark eyes catching the warped light of subspace. She made a series of soft clicks and trills, then held up the spanner, mimicking tightening a bolt in the air. A questioning chirp followed. "Yeah, it's a wrench," Kale sighed. "For fixing things, broken things." He tapped the console where a diagnostic light stubbornly glowed yellow. "Like this ship." Lyra tilted her head, her gaze following his finger. She stepped closer, gliding silently across the deck until she stood beside his chair. The electrocrane scent intensified again, mingling with the ship's usual smell of recycled air and engine oil. She reached out, her long fingers hovering over the blinking yellow light. Kale tensed, ready to slap her hand away again, but she hesitated, looking at him. Her scales flickered with amber light, a question in color. "Go ahead," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Can't make it worse." Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her fingertip cool and smooth despite the scales pressed against the diagnostic panel. The light flickered rapidly, then steadied, turning green. A soft chime indicated the system had reset. Kale stared. He'd been fiddling with that sensor relay for 3 cycles. Lyra retracted her hand, the amber fatting back to teal. She made a soft, satisfied humming sound like a cat purring. How did you do that?" She tapped the panel again, then tapped her own temple, her scales briefly flashing with complex interwoven patterns of light. She trilled softly. "Right, alien space magic, got it." Kale slumped back in his seat, a reluctant sort of awe warring with his ingrained suspicion. Maybe having her around wasn't entirely a disaster. If she could fix his ship just by touching it. Lyra leaned closer, her attention shifting from the console to him. Her gaze swept over his face, lingering on his eyes, his mouth. The air thickened again, the low hum vibrating through the chair. He felt pinned by her scrutiny, an uncomfortable warmth spreading across his neck. Her tail brushed against his leg, a feather-like contact that sent an unexpected jolt up his spine. He jerked his leg away. Personal space. Lyra blinked slowly, the iridescent scales around her eyes catching the light. She didn't move back. Instead, she mirrored his earlier gesture, pointing at him, then herself, then making a circling motion with her hand that encompassed the entire cramped cockpit. A low, questioning rumble accompanied the gesture. He scrubbed a hand over his jaw. "Yeah, okay, shared space. Doesn't mean you get to touch." He struggled for the right word. "Poke, prod, whatever it is you're doing with the tail." She tilted her head, a gesture he was starting to recognize as thoughtful confusion. She touched her own tail, then looked back at him, trilling softly. It sounded almost apologetic, almost. Then a slow, deliberate smile spread across her alien features. It wasn't human, not exactly, wider, showing a glimpse of pearlescent teeth, but the intent was unmistakable. Mischief. Her tail deliberately swished again, the feathery tip brushing against his boot this time. Kale groaned, dropping his head into his hands. This alien was going to be the death of him, or worse, make him enjoy the ride. Kale needed caffeine. Badly. He also needed about 10 light-years of distance from the unnervingly perceptive, occasionally ship-fixing alien currently occupying his co-pilot's seat like she owned the place. Lyra seemed fascinated by the star charts displayed on the secondary screen, her scales shifting through shades of deep space indigo and nebulae pink as she traced the glowing lines with a fingertip. Her tail was coiled neatly on the seat beside her, a temporary truce declared after the boot-brushing incident. He keyed the sequence for the nutrient paste dispenser, coffee flavor, extra stim, and waited for the machine's pathetic wheeze. "So," he started, leaning against the bulkhead, trying to project an air of casual command he absolutely didn't feel. "Where exactly were you headed before you decided my cargo hold was prime real estate?" Lyra turned from the star chart, her obsidian eyes reflecting the swirling star patterns. She made a complex series of clicks and whistles, accompanied by subtle shifts in her glow, a flash of urgent red, smoothed over by a calming blue. He raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, that clears it right up," she sighed, a soft exhalation that ruffled the feathery tip of her tail. She pointed towards the star chart, tapping a sector Kale recognized vaguely as disputed territory near the Cathar Nebula pirate havens and abandoned mining colonies. Then she made a fist, holding it tightly, her scales flaring bright crimson. She followed this with a sharp, slicing gesture across her own throat, the crimson dimming to a dangerous gray. Kale's stomach tightened, running from someone who wanted her dead, that tracked with finding her hidden on a derelict wreck. "Bad guys?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She nodded slowly, her gaze distant for a moment. The gray faded, replaced by a determined, almost fierce orange. She tapped her own chest again. "Lyra." Then she pointed out the viewport towards the endless starfield. A long, low trill followed, full of longing and something that sounded like resolve. "You're trying to get somewhere specific," Kale guessed. "Home." She shook her head, the movement sharp. The orange intensified. She pointed again at the Cathar sector on the map, then made a gesture like grabbing something, pulling it towards herself. Reclaiming something, or rescuing someone. Before he could ask, she shifted focus back to him, her expression turning playful again. The orange softened to a warm gold. She uncoiled slightly, leaning towards him across the space between the seats. "Kale," she purred, testing the sound again. She reached out, her fingers tracing the worn patch on the knee of his flight suit. He froze. Her touch was cool, sending shivers across his skin despite the layers of fabric. He should pull away, he knew he should. But her eyes held his, curious and intense, and the low hum vibrating from her seemed to short-circuit his brain's warning system. "What?" he managed, his voice tight. Lyra's smile widened. She tapped his knee, then tapped her own scaled thigh. A soft click. Then she deliberately brushed her fingers higher, tracing the seam along his inner thigh. Kale sucked in a sharp breath, his entire body going rigid. "Okay, boundaries." He slapped her hand away, maybe a little harder than necessary, scrambling back a step. "We talked about this. No touching." Lyra snatched her hand back, her scales flashing a surprised, almost hurt shade of violet before settling into a defensive, spiky pattern of silver and black. She hissed softly, a sound like escaping steam, and drew herself up, radiating indignation. She gestured sharply between them, then made a series of rapid, sharp clicks, her tail lashing behind her. He didn't need a translator to understand that. She was calling him out, probably on mixed signals or his general jumpiness. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Look, it's different for humans. How did you explain physical intimacy versus casual contact to a species that seemed to communicate through touch? Touching like that, it means something." Lyra tilted her head, the spiky pattern softening slightly, replaced by swirling blues of confusion. She pointed at his hand, the one that had slapped hers, then touched her own arm where he'd made contact. A questioning trill. "No, that's out, damn it." He'd backed right into the nutrient dispenser, which chose that moment to eject his lukewarm coffee paste, splattering it down the front of his already stained flight suit. Lyra stared at the mess, then back at his face. The confusion in her eyes slowly melted away, replaced by amusement. A low chuckle rumbled in her chest, and her scales began to sparkle with undisguised mirth, cycling through bright, cheerful yellows and greens. She pointed at the coffee stain, then at him, and let out a series of delighted chirps that sounded suspiciously like laughter. Kale glared, wiping futilely at the sticky paste. Trapped on a tiny ship with a tactile alien fugitive who thought his profound awkwardness was peak comedy. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. The uneasy truce, punctuated by Lyra's occasional delighted chirps whenever she caught sight of the lingering coffee stain on his flight suit, held for another cycle. Kale focused on pushing the rust bucket's aging engines, trying to put distance between them and the Cathar sector. The place Lyra indicated she was running from, and paradoxically, also seemed determined to reach. He needed fuel, supplies, and maybe a translation device that worked on trills and mood lighting. He set a course for Xylo's station, a sprawling, chaotic scavenger outpost tucked into an asteroid belt, not exactly reputable but usually free of major faction patrols. As they approached the station's outer markers, a proximity alert blared through the cockpit. Kale's head snapped up. Bogey, closing fast. No transponder signal. Lyra went instantly still, the playful glow on her scales vanishing, replaced by a stark, flat gray. All amusement fled her eyes, leaving only cold vigilance. She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the tactical display Kale brought up. A single ship, sleek and dark, knife-like in design, was accelerating towards them on an intercept course. "Pirates," Kale muttered, hands flying over the controls, diverting power to shields and engines. Or, he glanced at Lyra. Her scales were now shifting rapidly between gray and a deep, angry crimson. Her tail lashed rhythmically against the deck plating. "Or the guys you sliced your throat at." She gave a sharp, affirmative click, her eyes narrowing. The crimson deepened. She pointed at the approaching ship icon, then made a fist tight and menacing. "Right, great," Kale swore, banking the rust bucket hard, trying to use a dense cluster of asteroids for cover. The ship was old, reliable, but not fast, not compared to whatever that hunter was. "Strap in." Lyra didn't need telling twice. She flowed into the co-pilot seat, her fingers instinctively finding the harness release and snapping it shut with practiced ease. Where did an exiled fugitive learn G-force protocols? The hunter fired. Energy bolts stitched across the space where they'd been moments before. Kale gritted his teeth, weaving through the asteroid field, alarms screaming as near misses rattled the hull. "Can you do that fixing thing on the shields?" he yelled over the din. Lyra's hands flew over the co-pilot console, her scales flashing complex equations of light Kale couldn't begin to decipher. Power levels surged on the shield display, stabilizing just as another volley struck home, rocking the ship violently. Kale fought the controls, the stick bucking in his grip. "They're trying to disable, not destroy," he grunted, glancing at the tactical. "Worse, they want you intact." Lyra hissed, a low, dangerous sound. She pointed at a narrow gap between two spinning asteroids. "There," Kale saw it. "Insanely tight, probably suicidal." "Are you crazy?" She slammed her fist on the console, her scales flaring pure white-hot intensity. A sharp, commanding bark of clicks and whistles cut through the noise. "Trust me." He didn't know how he understood, but the meaning was unmistakable. Maybe it was the sheer force of her will, maybe the way her vibrating hum seemed to sync with his own racing pulse. Maybe he was just out of options. "Hang on." He shoved the throttle forward, aiming the rust bucket straight for the gap. The ship groaned in protest. Asteroid rock filled the viewport, impossibly close. He could see the striations, the impact craters. Time seemed to slow. Lyra was utterly focused, her hands dancing over her console, fine-tuning shield modulation, her glow a focused laser beam of concentration. Her tail was rigid, braced against the deck. They shot through the gap. Metal screamed as the port stabilizer wing scraped against rock, sending sparks showering past the viewport. Alarms shrieked, warning lights flashed like a deranged nebula. But they were through. Kale risked a look back. The hunter ship, larger and less maneuverable, hesitated at the gap, then peeled off, unwilling to risk the passage. He let out a shaky breath, his hands slippery with sweat on the controls. "You are absolutely insane." Lyra slumped back in her seat, the intense white glow fading rapidly, leaving her scales a pale, washed-out lavender. She looked drained, her breathing shallow. She turned to him, a flicker of the earlier gold returning to her eyes. A weak trill. "Worked," Kale admitted, scrubbing a hand over his face. The adrenaline was starting to ebb, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a startling awareness of her proximity. They were crammed together, shoulder to shoulder, the shared danger a palpable static charge between them. He could still feel the phantom pressure of her hand on his thigh, the memory colliding awkwardly with the image of her fierce competence moments ago. She watched him, her gaze soft, searching. The lavender deepened slightly, warming towards pink. She reached out slowly this time, her fingers hovering near the pulse pounding in his neck. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Just watched her, his own breath caught in his chest. Her fingertip brushed his skin, cool and smooth. A jolt, electric and surprising, shot through him, raising goosebumps on his arms. It wasn't unpleasant, far from it. Lyra's eyes widened slightly, her scales flashing a brilliant, surprised rose. The hum in the cockpit intensified, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. He felt seen, exposed but not threatened, just acknowledged. Then a cascade of warning lights lit up the main console. Hull breach, stabilizer damaged, life support fluctuating. The moment shattered. Damn it, Cale breathed, tearing his gaze away from hers, forcing his attention back to the dying ship around them. Looks like we're not making it to Xylo's station after all. The rust bucket didn't so much land as controlled crash onto the jungle moon Cale had aimed for, the nearest gravity well that wasn't actively trying to kill them. They skidded through dense, luminescent foliage, tearing a path through alien trees dripping glowing sap, before finally shuddering to a halt nose down in a shallow, muddy ravine. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the hiss of escaping coolant and the frantic chirping of unseen alien insects outside. Cale unbuckled himself, every muscle protesting. "Status report," he croaked, wincing as he tried to check the main console. "Dead, completely dead." "Okay, new plan, status report, we're screwed." Lyra was already out of her seat, moving with a fluid grace that belied the violent landing. She ran a hand over the dead console, her scales flickering a worried blue-gray. She trilled softly, a sound laced with concern, then looked at him, tilting her head towards the rear of the ship. "Yeah, escape pods are probably," he trailed off as she shook her head vehemently. She pointed at him, then at herself, then made a gesture indicating staying together. "Right, no splitting up. Especially not with potential hunters still out there, even if they had evaded them for now. And especially not on an unknown, potentially hostile moon." He popped the seals on the cockpit canopy. Thick, humid air, heavy with the scent of damp earth, exotic blooms, and something vaguely metallic, flooded the space. The sounds of the jungle rushed in, clicks, whistles, screeches, a low, guttural growl somewhere in the distance. "Lovely." "All right," Cale sighed, grabbing his emergency pack and pulse rifle. "Let's see what fresh hell we've crashed into." Lyra followed him out, her senses clearly on high alert. Her head swiveled, taking in the alien surroundings, her scales shifting through greens and browns, attempting camouflage against the dense vegetation. Her tail moved constantly, testing the air, brushing against strange, glowing fungi clinging to the ravine walls. They needed shelter, water, and a way to repair the ship's comms array if they ever wanted to call for help, or more likely, figure out how to fix the ship themselves. The ravine offered some immediate cover. Cale scanned the muddy ground. Tracks. Large, three-toed prints, definitely not made by anything friendly-looking. "Company," he muttered, nodding towards the prints. Lyra crouched instantly, examining them, her hand hovering just above the mud. She made a low clicking sound, then wrinkled her nose, her scales flashing a brief warning yellow. "Predator. Big one." She straightened, her gaze sweeping the upper edges of the ravine. She pointed towards a dense cluster of hanging vines and thick, broad-leafed plants further down. "Shelter." He nodded. Staying out in the open was asking for trouble. They moved cautiously, Cale taking point with the rifle, Lyra covering their backs, her silence and heightened senses invaluable. The jungle floor was a mess of tangled roots and bioluminescent moss. Twice, Lyra pulled him back just before he stepped on iridescent beetles that hissed aggressively or into sinkholes masked by deceptive foliage. They reached the cluster of vines. Behind them, partially hidden by the curtain of leaves, was a shallow cave entrance, carved into the ravine wall by time and water. It wasn't deep, maybe 10 meters, but it was dry and defensible. "This'll have to do," Cale said, ducking inside. The air was cooler here, smelling faintly of minerals and damp stone. Lyra followed, her glow intensifying slightly in the dimness, casting shifting patterns on the cave walls. She immediately began exploring the small space, running her hands over the rock face, her tail lightly dusting the floor. Cale dropped his pack with a thud, the exhaustion hitting him full force now that the adrenaline had completely faded. He sank onto the cave floor, leaning his head back against the cool stone, rifle across his lap. He watched Lyra move. She paused, her hand flat against the far wall. A low hum started, deeper than usual, resonating through the stone itself. The bioluminescent patterns on her scales pulsed in time with the hum, casting waves of soft light. It felt soothing. Like the cave itself was breathing with her. After a moment she turned back to him, her expression unreadable in the dim, shifting light. She glided over, sinking gracefully onto the ground facing him, close enough that their knees almost touched. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the residue of the chase, the crash, the intimate moment shattered by alarms. He could smell the ozone clinging to her, mixed with the scent of the jungle mud and her own unique electrocrane fragrance. Her eyes searched his face, intense and unwavering. She reached out not towards his neck this time, but towards the rip in his flight suit sleeve, where a nasty scrape from the crash was sluggishly bleeding. Her cool fingers brushed against his skin just below the wound. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. Her touch anchored him, a point of stillness in the chaos of the last few hours. The low hum intensified, vibrating through her fingers into his arm. It wasn't healing, not exactly, but the sharp sting of the scrape dulled, replaced by a warm, tingling sensation. It felt intimate, strangely profound, this silent act of care in the heart of a hostile wilderness. Her gaze lifted from his arm to meet his eyes. The glow on her scales softened to a gentle rose gold, warm and inviting. A single soft trill escaped her lips, a question and an offering all in one. Cale swallowed, his throat dry. The guarded walls he'd spent years building felt paper-thin under that look, under that touch. He wanted to resist, to maintain distance, but the shared danger, the forced proximity, and this undeniable connection humming between them was rapidly eroding his defenses. He slowly reached out, his hand hovering over her scaled forearm, mirroring her earlier hesitation. Cale's fingers finally made contact with her forearm. The scales were cool and smooth like polished river stones, but beneath them he felt the warmth of her body, the subtle thrum of energy that seemed to animate her very being. Her glow pulsed under his touch, the rose gold deepening, swirling with threads of brighter gold. Lyra's breath hitched, a soft intake of air. Her obsidian eyes widened slightly, pupils dilating. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch almost imperceptibly, her own hand remaining gently on his injured arm. The silence in the cave stretched, filled only by the distant jungle sounds and the low, resonant hum emanating from Lyra, a hum that seemed to twine around Cale's own heartbeat. This was different from the accidental brushes, the playful prods, the near-miss intimacy in the cockpit. This was deliberate, exploratory, a conscious crossing of a line. His thumb brushed over the intricate pattern of her scales. They shifted minutely under his touch, the colors flowing like liquid light. It was mesmerizing. He felt a strange urge to trace the patterns, to map the constellations hidden beneath her skin. He lifted his gaze from her arm to her face. Her expression was open, vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. The usual playful dominance was gone, replaced by a raw curiosity, a palpable sense of anticipation. He could see the pulse beating in the smooth skin of her throat, her bioluminescence highlighting the elegant line of her neck. He wanted to touch her there. He wanted to lean closer, breathe in that intoxicating electrocrane scent. He wanted to understand the language spoken by her shifting light, the meaning behind the resonant hum that vibrated deep within his chest. "Lyra," he whispered, the name feeling different on his tongue now, weighted with this new intimacy. She responded with a soft trill, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief moment, as if savoring the sound, the connection. Her hand tightened slightly on his arm, her touch sending another wave of warmth through him, chasing away the lingering chill of the crash in the damp cave air. He leaned forward, closing the small distance between them. His other hand came up, cupping her jawline. Her skin was impossibly soft beneath the fine scales that dusted her cheekbones. She tilted her head, pressing gently into his palm, a gesture of trust that made his heart ache. Her eyes opened again, dark pools reflecting the soft glow emanating from her own body. He could see himself reflected there, small and insignificant against the vastness of her alien gaze. Yet there was no judgment, only acceptance, fascination. He lowered his head, his lips hovering scant centimeters from hers. Her breath hitched again, warm against his skin. He could feel the vibrations of her hum more intensely now, a physical force resonating between them. Her lips parted slightly. They were a deep, dusky rose color, fuller than a human's, with a subtle curve that hinted at her earlier smiles. He hesitated. Was this right? Was he misreading everything? Could a human, and whatever Lyra was, even? His doubts were silenced by Lyra herself. She closed the final gap, her lips pressing against his. It wasn't a demanding kiss, but one of startling gentleness, of profound curiosity. Her lips were cool at first, then warmed rapidly against his. They were softer than he expected, yielding. The sensation was electric, sending a shockwave through his system that had nothing to do with static discharge. He responded instinctively, deepening the kiss, his hand sliding from her jaw to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the surprisingly fine, almost feathery ridges that ran along her scalp. She made a soft sound deep in her throat, a pleased rumble that vibrated against his mouth. Her arms came up, wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. Her scaled body pressed against his chest, cool through the fabric of his flight suit, yet radiating an inner heat. The kiss deepened, becoming less tentative, more demanding. Her tongue, surprisingly human-like but perhaps a fraction longer, flicked against his lips, seeking entrance. He granted it, gasping as she explored his mouth with an intensity that mirrored her gaze. It was alien and familiar all at once, a whirlwind of new sensations, the smooth texture of her scales against his skin, the faint taste of ozone and something sweeter, wildflower-like, the constant, low hum that seemed to emanate from her core, resonating through his bones. He lost himself in the kiss, in the feel of her, the shared warmth pushing back the fear and uncertainty of their situation. The cave, the jungle, the hunters, they all faded away, leaving only this connection, this spark ignited between two disparate souls lost in the vastness of space. The kiss broke, leaving them both breathless, foreheads resting against each other. Cale's heart was pounding, a wild drum against his ribs. Lyra's glow was a riot of color, swirling pinks, golds, and deep violets, pulsing in time with her rapid breathing. Her dark eyes searched his, wide and luminous. He could feel the fine tremor in her hands where they rested on his shoulders. "Wow," Cale breathed out, the word inadequate. Lyra echoed the exhale, a soft whoosh of air. She traced the line of his jaw with a fingertip, her touch sending fresh shivers down his spine. A complex series of soft clicks and trills followed, melodic and questioning. He wished desperately he could understand the nuances, the specifics of what she was trying to convey. "I don't," he started, then shook his head. "Words are kind of failing me right now." He offered a shaky smile. She mirrored it, her alien features softening into an expression of pure, unadulterated pleasure. She nudged his forehead gently with hers, a gesture that felt incredibly intimate. Then she pulled back slightly, her gaze dropping to his chest, then sweeping down his body before returning to his eyes. Her own gaze darkened, the playful curiosity replaced by a raw, primal hunger that sent a jolt of heat straight to his groin. The air in the cave grew thick again, charged with a different kind of energy. Her scales shifted, the colors deepening, darkening to shades of crimson and deep purple, edged with flickering silver. The light she emitted seemed brighter, hotter. Her tail, which had been resting quietly, now began to sway slowly behind her, the feathery tip brushing against the cave floor. Cale felt his own body responding, desire coiling low in his belly, sharp and insistent. The crash, the danger, seemed irrelevant compared to the immediate, overwhelming need sparked by her look, by the memory of her kiss. He reached out, his hand tracing the curve of her waist, feeling the surprising strength beneath the smooth scales. She leaned into his touch, her eyes half-lidded, a low purr rumbling in her chest again, deeper and more resonant than before. He slid his hand lower over the curve of her hip, learning the shape of her. She was all lean muscle and fluid grace, utterly alien yet undeniably female. Her hand found the zipper on his flight suit. Her fingers fumbled with the mechanism for a moment, her scales flashing a brief flicker of frustration, before she managed to pull it down, exposing the thin thermal shirt he wore underneath. Her cool palm pressed flat against his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the heat of her touch through the fabric, feel the way her hum seemed to sync with his frantic heartbeat. He sucked in a sharp breath as her fingers traced the contours of his pectoral muscle, her touch both exploratory and possessive. He tugged gently at the neckline of her own attire, a simple, dark, form-fitting garment that seemed woven from the same material as her scales, leaving her arms and neck bare. It yielded easily under his touch, revealing the smooth, scaled skin of her collarbone, the elegant curve of her shoulder. Her skin glowed faintly, the light pulsing beneath his fingers. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to the spot just below her collarbone, tasting the faint ozone, the exotic floral notes. Lyra arched her back, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands clenched in the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. The intensity ratcheting up, swift and overwhelming. He fumbled with the fastenings of her top, needing to feel more of her skin against his. She helped him, her movements quick, efficient. Garment loosened, revealing the soft swell of her breasts, covered in the same fine iridescent scales, glowing with deep rose and violet light. They were shaped differently from a human woman, perhaps slightly higher, firmer, but undeniably beautiful, mesmerizing in their alienness. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against the peak of one breast. The scales were incredibly sensitive, he realized as Lyra gasped sharply, her whole body trembling. Her glow flared, momentarily blinding him. He drew back slightly, concerned he'd hurt her. "Okay," he murmured. Her eyes snapped open, blazing with crimson fire. She shook her head, not in negation but in urgency. A single sharp click, more need, understanding dawned. He lowered his head again, taking the scaled peak into his mouth, gently at first, then with increasing pressure as she writhed beneath him, her purr turning into a low growl of pleasure. Her hands tangled in his hair, holding him fiercely against her. The cave seemed to shrink around them, the air electric, thick with their mingled scents and ragged breaths. Cale felt consumed, overwhelmed by the sensory onslaught, the sight of her glowing skin, the smooth texture of her scales against his tongue, the deep vibration of her pleasure resonating through his skull, the intoxicating scent of her arousal. This was uncharted territory, wild and exhilarating. All his carefully constructed walls had crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable but fiercely alive. He pulled away from her breast, meeting her heated gaze. There was no room for doubt now, no space for fear. Only this raw, undeniable connection, this desperate need to bridge the gap between their worlds, one touch, one kiss, one shared breath at a time. He lowered his mouth to hers again, capturing her growl with his own groan, surrendering completely to the storm they had unleashed. The remnants of their clothes lay discarded on the dusty cave floor. Cale knelt before Lyra, his hands mapping the contours of her scaled body, awestruck by the sheer alien beauty of her. Her skin glowed intensely, a canvas of shifting, passionate color, deep crimsons, pulsing violets, flashes of electric blue. The air hummed with her energy, a palpable force that resonated within his own chest. Her hands explored him with equal fervor, her cool, smooth fingers tracing the lines of his muscles, learning the unfamiliar landscape of his human form. Her touch was tentative yet confident, her curiosity mingling with undisguised desire. Each point of contact sent sparks across his skin, heightening his already frantic arousal. He leaned forward, pressing kisses along the elegant line of her neck, breathing in her scent. She arched into him, exposing more of her glowing skin, her head tipped back, a low moan escaping her lips. Her tail wrapped around his waist, the scaled muscle surprisingly strong, pulling him flush against her. The sensation of her scales against his bare skin was incredible, smooth, cool, yet radiating an inner heat. He ran his hands down her back, following the elegant curve of her spine, feeling the subtle ridges beneath the scales. She shivered under his touch, her glow brightening. He reached the base of her spine where her tail joined her body and hesitated. Was it sensitive, erogenous? He brushed his fingers lightly over the area. Lyra gasped, her back arching sharply, her hips pressing against his. Her eyes flew open, blazing with an incandescent mix of pleasure and surprise. A series of rapid, high-pitched trills spilled from her lips. Okay, definitely sensitive. He explored further, applying gentle pressure, rewarded by her increasingly urgent sounds and the way her body writhed against his. Her hands clenched on his shoulders, her blunt talons pressing slightly into his skin, not enough to break the surface, but enough to convey the intensity of her response. She pulled him down, maneuvering them until he was lying on his back on the cool cave floor, her lithe form poised above him. Her eyes, molten pools of crimson light, devoured him. She lowered her head, her tongue flicking out to taste the skin over his collarbone, sending fire racing through his veins. Her tail tightened around his waist, anchoring him. He watched, mesmerized, as she explored his body, her touch igniting nerve endings he didn't know he possessed. Her scales brushed against his skin, a fascinating friction that was both alien and intensely erotic. When her mouth closed over one of his nipples, he cried out, arching off the ground. The sensation was unexpectedly intense, almost overwhelming. She paused, looking up at him, a questioning tilt to her head, her lips slick. He could only nod, breathless, urging her on. She smiled, a predatory flash of pearlescent teeth, before returning to her ministrations, her tongue and lips driving him wild. He reached between them, his hand closing around her hip, needing to feel her, to connect on a deeper level. His fingers brushed against the juncture of her thighs. She went utterly still for a moment, her glow faltering before surging back even brighter, hotter. She shifted her weight, pressing herself against his hand, a low growl rumbling in her chest. He explored her gently, discovering the unique configuration of her sex. It was different, yet fundamentally similar, folds of sensitive, scaled tissue surrounding a moist, warm core. She moaned, a long, low sound that vibrated through the cave as his fingers slipped inside her. She was wet, hot, incredibly tight. Her inner tissues were smooth, lacking the fine scales of her outer skin, pulsing faintly around his fingers. He moved slowly, learning her rhythm, watching her face as her eyes fluttered closed, her head thrown back, her glow washing the cave in waves of ecstatic light. Her hips began to move, meeting his touch, urging him deeper. The primal need clawed at him, demanding release, but he held back, wanting to savor this, wanting to understand her pleasure as much as his own. He used his other hand to cup her breast, his thumb brushing over the sensitive peak, rewarded by another sharp gasp, another surge of brilliant light. Lyra's control finally snapped. With a cry that was part growl, part sob, she lowered herself onto him, taking him inside her in one smooth, shocking motion. Cale roared, his eyes flying open as she impaled herself on his erection. The sensation was unbelievable, her tight heat enveloping him, the friction of her inner walls against his length, the sheer alienness of it coupled with the universal intimacy of joining. She threw her head back again, her body shuddering, her glow flaring nova bright. He gripped her hips, pulling her down harder, burying himself to the hilt. She cried out again, moving instinctively, finding a rhythm that suited them both. It was frantic, desperate, fueled by adrenaline and weeks of suppressed tension. He met her thrusts, lifting his hips off the floor, driving deeper, wanting all of her. Her scales abraded his skin slightly, a pleasurable friction that only heightened the sensations. Her scent filled his senses, intoxicating. Her hum surrounded him, vibrated through him, becoming a part of his own arousal. He felt connected to her in a way that transcended the physical, as if their energies were intertwining, merging in the dim light of the cave. He felt the pressure building, the inevitable climax approaching like a tidal wave. He looked up at Lyra, at her face contorted in pleasure, her scales blazing like a captured star. He saw her beauty, her strength, her vulnerability. He saw her. "Lyra," he gasped, his voice raw. Her eyes snapped open, locking with his. In that instant, something shifted. The frantic energy gentled, replaced by a profound sense of connection, of seeing and being seen. Her movements slowed, became more deliberate, each thrust sending waves of pleasure radiating through both of them. Her glow softened, shifting to warm golds and deep oceanic blues. Her climax washed over her first, a series of violent shudders racking her body, her cry echoing off the cave walls, her inner muscles clenching tightly around him. The sight, the sound, the feel of her release shattered his own control. With a guttural groan, he poured himself into her, his own release ripping through him, white-hot and absolute. They collapsed together, slick with sweat and exertion, their bodies trembling, their mingled scents filling the small space. Cale held her close, burying his face in her hair, feeling the frantic pounding of her heart against his chest, listening to the soft clicks and trills that were her version of contented sighs. The cave was silent again, save for their ragged breathing and the distant, alien sounds of the jungle. Cale felt utterly spent, yet strangely renewed. Something profound had happened here, something that went far beyond mere physical release. He had touched an alien soul and been touched in return, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. Afterwards they lay tangled together on the cave floor, the initial frantic energy replaced by a languid tenderness. Lyra rested her head on Cale's chest, her scales cool against his skin now, her glow faded to a soft, ambient pearl shimmer. One of her hands rested flat over his heart, her fingers occasionally twitching, as if mapping his slowing pulse. Her tail was loosely coiled around his leg, a possessive, comforting weight. Cale stroked her back, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns that were slowly re-emerging as her color stabilized. The silence wasn't awkward. It was companionable, filled with the echoes of their shared intensity. He felt raw, exposed, stripped of his usual defenses, but strangely peaceful. He'd shared the most intimate act possible with a being from another star system, a being whose language he barely understood, whose biology was a beautiful mystery. And somehow it felt more real, more honest than any connection he'd ever forced himself to make before. Lyra stirred, lifting her head to look at him. Her dark eyes were soft, searching. She reached up, tracing the lines of his face with a gentle finger, his brow, his cheekbone, the curve of his lips. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her scaled palm. She made a soft, questioning trill. "I don't regret this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not any of it." He wasn't sure how much she understood, but he needed to say it. Her eyes seemed to brighten, a flicker of understanding or perhaps just empathy crossing her features. She responded with a series of low, melodic clicks, her hand tightening in his. She then pointed towards the cave entrance, towards the darkening jungle outside, her expression growing serious. The reminder of their predicament settled back over them. They were still stranded, hunted on an unknown world. The intimacy they'd shared didn't change the danger, but somehow it changed him. He wasn't just trying to survive anymore, he was trying to survive with her. He sat up, pulling her with him. "Okay, priorities. Shelter is secure for now. Need water, food assessment, and figure out how bad the ship damage really is." Lyra nodded, already moving, pulling on her strange, dark garment with fluid efficiency. Cale dressed as well, his body protesting slightly, acutely aware of the faint abrasions from her scales, souvenirs of their encounter. He checked his rifle, the weight familiar and reassuring, yet feeling different in his hands now. Protecting himself had always been instinct. Protecting them felt like a conscious choice. They ventured out of the cave cautiously as twilight painted the alien sky in hues of violet and orange. The jungle sounds intensified, shifting from daytime chirps to nighttime clicks and guttural calls. Strange, luminescent plants pulsed with soft light, illuminating their path. Lyra moved with innate confidence, her senses clearly far superior to his in the dimming light. She pointed out a stream trickling down the ravine wall, the water glowing faintly. After testing it cautiously, Lyra sniffing it, then touching a drop to her tongue before nodding approval, Cale filled their canteens. Finding food proved more challenging. Lyra identified several brightly colored fruits, shaking her head vigorously and flashing warning reds when Cale reached for them. She eventually located some large, pale tubers growing near the base of a massive, fern-like tree. She dug one up with surprising strength, broke it open, sniffed it carefully, and offered him a piece. It tasted starchy, slightly sweet and blessedly non-poisonous. They ate in silence, watching the alien constellations emerge in the sky above the ravine. Back at the wreck, the situation looked grim. The hull breach was significant, the engines were offline, and the comms array was mangled beyond recognition. Cale ran the internal diagnostics on backup power, the results confirming his fears. "We're not flying out of here anytime soon," he said grimly, leaning against the buckled hull. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her scales a calming blue. She pointed at the damaged comms, then tapped her own temple, her glow flickering with complex patterns. "An idea. Can you interface with it like you did with the console?" She tilted her head, considering. She ran her hand over the twisted metal, her glow pulsing. After a moment she shook her head, emitting a frustrated click. "Too damaged." She then pointed towards the Cathar sector direction, back the way they came, then made a gesture of searching, reaching. her people. A specific technology she needed. Whatever you're looking for, Kale said, meeting her gaze, it seems we're stuck here until we can fix this bird or until your friends or enemies find us. Lyra looked from the ship to him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then determination hardened her features. She tapped the ship, then pointed towards the jungle, then tapped her own chest. We survive. We adapt. He nodded slowly. Okay, we adapt. He looked at her, really looked at her, the shifting light of her scales, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet strength radiating from her. Fear was still present, a cold knot in his gut, but it was overshadowed by something else. Hope, and a fierce protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. Together, he added, reaching out to take her hand. Her scaled fingers curled around his, cool and strong, her glow-warmed gold light washing over them in the twilight. Together. Days bled into weeks on the jungle moon. Kale and Lyra fell into a routine dictated by survival and the slow, painstaking work of repairing the rust bucket. Kale, with his mechanical knowledge, focused on patching the hull and trying to coax life back into the engines, cannibalizing non-essential systems for parts. Lyra, whose connection to technology seemed intuitive and almost biological, worked on the delicate electronics, often spending hours with her hands pressed against circuitry panels, her scales glowing with focused concentration, coaxing damaged systems back online in ways Kale couldn't fathom. Their communication evolved beyond simple gestures and Kale's one-sided monologues. Lyra began mimicking his words more frequently, her pronunciation still alien but increasingly understandable. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her bioluminescence, the flick of her tail, the pitch and rhythm of her clicks and trills, associating specific patterns with concepts: danger, safety, hunger, curiosity, affection. Touch remained their primary language, bridging the gaps words couldn't cross. A shared glance across the wreck site, followed by Lyra gliding over to brush her fingers against his arm, Kale resting his hand on the small of her back as they navigated treacherous terrain. Nights spent huddled together for warmth and comfort in the small cave, her glowing body a beacon against the darkness, their breathing synchronized. The jungle remained a constant threat. They learned the patterns of the local predators, the safe zones, the times when the massive, three-toed carnivores hunted. Lyra's senses were their early warning system. More than once, her sharp hiss and a flash of warning crimson pulled Kale back from the brink of becoming something's dinner. He, in turn, protected her from hazards her senses didn't register: unstable rock formations, hidden pockets of corrosive gas escaping geothermal vents. They became a team, their disparate skills complementing each other, their reliance mutual. The intimacy they discovered in the cave deepened, evolving from frantic passion into something quieter, more profound. Shared meals of roasted tubers and strange, sweet fruits became moments of connection. Helping each other clean wounds sustained during salvage work transformed into gentle caresses. Sometimes, Kale would watch her as she worked on the ship, mesmerized by the flow of light across her scales, the intense focus in her eyes. She would often look up, catching his gaze, and offer him a slow, soft smile that made his heart ache with a confusing mix of tenderness and desire. One evening, sitting by the flickering light of a controlled fire they'd managed to start outside the cave, Lyra picked up a smooth, dark stone. She turned it over in her hands, her scales glowing a soft, contemplative blue. She looked at Kale, then held the stone out to him. "Kale," she said, her voice soft, the syllables more practiced now. She tapped his chest, then tapped her own. She held the stone between them. Together, she managed, the word clearly costing her effort. "Stone, strong." He took the stone. It was cool and solid in his palm, he understood. Their bond, their unlikely partnership, was like the stone, solid, enduring, forged in hardship. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "Strong, together." He reached out, brushing a stray feathery ridge away from her cheek. "Lyra." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly, her glow warming to a gentle rose. She made a soft humming sound, the vibration resonating not just in the air but deep within him, a familiar, comforting frequency. It was the sound of belonging. Later that night, curled together in the cave, the jungle sounds a distant lullaby. Kale felt Lyra trace patterns on his back with her fingertip. He turned, pulling her closer, burying his face in the unique scent of her skin. Their lovemaking now was less about frantic release and more about exploration, communication, a silent affirmation of their bond. He learned the places that made her glow brighter, the touches that elicited soft trills of pleasure, the way her scales seemed to hum against his skin when she was truly lost in the moment. She, in turn, discovered his sensitivities, her touch both exquisitely gentle and fiercely possessive, learning his body with an intensity that left him breathless. After lying spent and content, Lyra rested her head on his shoulder. She tapped his cheek gently. "Feel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She pressed her hand flat against his chest again. "Here." Then she pressed her own chest where her internal light pulsed softly. "Feel." Kale swallowed the lump in his throat. He understood. She wasn't just talking about physical sensation. She was talking about the resonance between them, the emotional current that flowed beneath the surface, the connection that defied species and language. "I feel it," he whispered back, holding her tightly. "I feel it too." He had come to this jungle moon broken and alone, focused only on survival. Now, looking at the alien woman curled against him, her light a soft beacon in the darkness, he realized he'd found something far more valuable. He'd found a reason to live, not just survive. He'd found Lyra, and the thought of losing her was now more terrifying than any predator lurking in the jungle outside. The day the engines finally sputtered to life felt like a miracle. Kale whooped, startling a flock of iridescent birds from the nearby trees, while Lyra let out a series of joyful, high-pitched clicks, her scales flashing brilliant gold and cyan. It wasn't pretty. The rust bucket was scarred, patched, and running on hope and Lyra's alien intuition, but it was functional. They could leave. The question was, where would they go? Kale watched Lyra as she ran a final diagnostic sequence, her hand pressed against the main console, her glow steady and focused. Her goal had always been the Cathar sector, towards the danger they'd barely escaped. To reclaim something, rescue someone. He still didn't know the specifics, but going back there felt like suicide. "Lyra," he began carefully, walking up behind her, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders. She leaned back against him slightly, not breaking her concentration. "We fixed the ship. We can go anywhere, somewhere safe, far away from whatever chased you." She finished the diagnostic, the console chiming softly. She turned in the co-pilot's seat to face him, her expression serious. The joyful colors faded, replaced by a determined, unwavering orange. She shook her head. She pointed again towards the Cathar sector on the now functional star chart. Then she made the gesture he now understood clearly, grabbing, pulling towards herself. Reclaiming. She followed this by tapping her own temple, then making a radiating gesture outwards like a broadcast signal. Her scales flashed a complex pattern Kale associated with her species, her identity. It wasn't just something she needed to reclaim. It was part of her people, something vital. "What is it?" Kale asked softly. "What's so important you'd risk flying back into their teeth?" Lyra hesitated, searching for the words. She touched her chest, then Kale's. "Us," she said, the word soft but clear. Then she touched her temple again, the radiating gesture repeated with more urgency. "My song," she struggled with the concept. "Resonance connects all," she gestured widely, encompassing the ship, the stars, everything. They took it, silence. Her scales flickered with pain, a dull gray momentarily overlaying the orange. "Need back. For life." Kale stared, pieces clicking into place. The humming, the way she interacted with tech, the resonance he felt from her, it wasn't just individual quirks. It was part of her species' way of being, their connection to each other, perhaps to the universe itself. And someone had stolen or silenced this song. Likely the same people hunting her. Flying away, finding safety, would mean leaving her people silenced, disconnected. It would mean severing a part of herself. He understood her determination now. It wasn't recklessness, it was necessity. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He squeezed her shoulders. "Okay, we go get your song back." Relief washed over Lyra's face, so profound it made her glow waver. Tears, or the alien equivalent, shimmering droplets that caught the light, welled in her dark eyes. She surged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face against his chest. He held her tightly, feeling the tremors running through her body. "Together," she whispered against his flight suit, the word thick with emotion. Together, he echoed, stroking her back, feeling the smooth scales beneath his palm. He knew the risks, knew they were flying back into the heart of danger, vastly outnumbered and outgunned. But looking down at Lyra, feeling the strength of her conviction, the depth of their connection, he couldn't imagine making any other choice. His desire to stay alive, to stay free, had been eclipsed by a fiercer need. To protect her, to fight alongside her, to help her reclaim what was stolen. His guarded heart, the one he'd shielded for so long, had surrendered completely. Launching from the jungle moon felt like shedding an old skin. The patched-up rust bucket clawed its way into orbit, leaving the lush green world behind. Kale plotted the course back towards the Cathar sector, his jaw set. Lyra sat beside him, her earlier distress replaced by quiet resolve. Her scales held a steady, determined crimson hue. As they prepared for the jump to subspace, Lyra reached over, placing her hand over his on the throttle control. Her touch was cool, grounding. He looked at her. Her eyes were full of unspoken gratitude, trust, and something deeper, something that mirrored the fierce emotion surging within his own chest. Love. It wasn't a human word she would understand, perhaps, but the feeling was undeniable, a powerful resonance humming between them, stronger than any fear. He covered her hand with his own, their fingers intertwining. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, her gaze locked with his. A slow, confident smile spread across her features. "Ready," she confirmed, her voice clear and strong. Together they pushed the throttle forward, and the stars outside the viewport stretched into lines of light, pulling them towards an uncertain future, towards danger, towards the fight for Lyra's song. But they were facing it together. And somehow, that made all the difference.